On Friday, this week, 200 years ago, to the day, one of the most important poets who has ever lived died on a beach, well, near a beach in Greece. And that poet was a man called George Gordon, more famously known as Lord Byron. And the question about why he was there, why was he in Greece at that time, what led him there, is an incredible story in itself. He's a person who's got so many important dimensions. Perhaps one that would be interesting to you guys, which is something that Dr. Whickman is going to talk about, is the legacy that he left behind. So we can tend to think about poets and poetry as something perhaps that you encounter in your classrooms. I hope for some of you it's something more than that, something you might actually think as part of your life, part of something important. I would like to think that's a goal that we have in the literature department at Marymount, that you might actually realize that poetry helps us to live well. But as much as that is important, and all of the incredible art that Lord Byron produced, the effect that he had on culture and the effect that he had on, for example, many of the kind of film heroes that you might have watched and admired, literary figures that you might have read and really enjoyed, and kind of even down to kind of pop idols and rap stars. Yeah. Byron set the model for what it is to be, I don't know how to define it, but we sometimes call it an anti-hero. Yeah. Someone who breaks the mold, who challenges social norms, and yet is incredibly popular. Okay, feared and admired in the same thought, almost. So he is incredibly important in our culture, whether we've heard of him or not. For those of you who've read some of his poetry, you'll know that he's an incredibly entertaining, engaging writer of poetry. So marking this 200th year of his death is incredibly important for us as an international school, as a school that prides itself on its literature faculty. And we are incredibly lucky in doing this celebration, in meeting here and marking this important moment, to have one of Europe's top romantic poetry scholars here with us, Dr. Paul Whickman, from the University of Derby, and shortly to be appearing at a really important conference, which Miss Harden is also going to go to, at the birthplace and home of Lord Byron in England, Newstead Abbey. And so please, guys, focus, think of some interesting questions to ask Dr. Whickman, because this is an important moment for you to be encountering someone like Dr. Whickman and this topic, okay? With that, Dr. Whickman.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm not sure I'm one of the top scholars in Europe. I hope you won't be disappointed by that epithet at the end of this. But anyway, why should we look at this guy who died 200 years ago? Well, let's look at this really great stanza from his masterpiece of a poem called Don Juan, and we'll get onto the pronunciation in a little bit. But words are things, and a small drop of ink falling like dew upon a thought produces that which makes thousands, perhaps millions, think. 'Tis strange, the shortest letter which man uses instead of speech may form a lasting link of ages. To what straits old time reduces frail man, when paper, Even a rag like this survives himself, his tomb, and all that's his. So it's the idea of language, of poetry, surviving the mortal man. It's a link between ages. So he's speaking to us from 200 years ago. And this is from Don Juan Canto 3, so 200 and a bit years ago. So let's introduce Lord Byron then, quite a well-known figure in many ways. He was one of what you call the Big Six Romantic poets. He was the second generation of the Big Six, alongside John Keats, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and the older first generation, who outlived the second, William Wordsworth, William Blake, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Worth noting, he's called romantic, but that's kind of labelled after the fact. Byron himself would have hated to have been called a romantic. Yeah, it was would have suggested you a bit sentimental and liked frolicking around. He did frolic, but in a different way, perhaps. There we go. So he was born in London, but he spent his early childhood in Aberdeen, and he inherited Newstead Abbey, that Mr. Harvey was speaking about, in Nottinghamshire from his uncle, which was in ruins at the time. And so he had to move to central Nottingham, and his house in central Nottingham recently was renovated and sold for an awful lot of money, as you can imagine. It looks small from the outside, I think. Educated at Harrow School and then Cambridge. And a major fact is he kept the rules at the college at Cambridge, Trinity College, was that you couldn't keep a dog or a cat in your rooms. So he got a bear, because it wasn't prohibited by the rules of the college. How that worked, I don't know. Did the bear eat all his homework? He had a good excuse. And this is something I think is very relevant to you guys, and it's sort of the focus of my talk today, in a way, is he was famously well-travelled, probably one of the most famous poets for being very well-travelled, and he spent most of his adult life living abroad. And his travels inspired the poem that made him famous. There's a famous line that Byron said in the letter, I woke up overnight and found myself famous. And this poem was Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, the first cantos of which appeared in 1812. So I have to keep looking behind me to make sure I'm up to date. So Byron was a bit of a celebrity. I mentioned the Big Six Romantic poets. He was the only one who actually sold a lot. The others never really sold a lot in their lifetime. He was actually really popular as well. And he viewed himself at the same time as a bit of a hero of liberty. And he fought in the Greek war for independence against the Turks, then the Ottoman Empire. And in many ways, he's a Greek hero. In Greece, he's kind of pretty major figure, and we'll kind of get to that in a little bit. And another fact, he was famous for sleeping around. And one of his lovers and confidants, Lady Caroline Lamb, gave him the famous line, he was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. So, yeah, bit of a naughty boy in many ways. And he was divorced, which is quite scandalous at the time, and there were even rumours of incest with his half-sister. Yeah, that always gets lots of whispers there. That makes you read some of his poems a little bit differently. That's all I'll say. But what I want to kind of emphasize, though, is that his biography is fascinating, and his characters, though, that he has in his work, Mr. Harvey was talking about the anti-heroes, that we'll get to that in a minute. These characters are often confused with Byron himself, and that's kind of a mistake a lot of critics make, and lots of people approaching his poetry make. But it is worth noting that Byron himself didn't help, because he purposefully manipulated this persona. He sort of knew he was a bit of a celebrity, and sort of was having a bit of fun in doing it. Now, I'm not going to bore you with postmodernism, but some people have read that kind of manipulation of his public persona with this kind of fictional creations as an example of a kind of postmodern literary approach. And in short, postmodernism sort of blurs fiction and non-fiction. That'll do for this context, guys. I'm talking about romanticism today. Now, Mr. Harvey spoke about the brooding, dark anti-heroes, which became known as the Byronic hero. So those of you who've studied, say, Wuthering Heights, Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights is perhaps one of the most famous Byronic heroes, or Rochester from her sister's work, Jane Eyre, are famous examples of the Byronic hero. Kind of a guy with a dark past, is sort of an anti-hero, but sort of has a kind of noble spirit. That Byronic hero, again, sometimes people associate with Byron himself. There was loads of rumors about his mental illness and mental health issues that he had, often based on speculation. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this poem a little bit later. His poem Don Juan is widely considered to be his masterpiece, hugely influential text, and we're going to talk a little bit about this today, and we'll see why it's an important work in lots of ways. The reason why it's got a line of dates is because it was published in various cantos at different times, between 1819 and 1824, the final cantos at the year of his death, 200 years ago. Don Juan was attacked for being immoral, blasphemous in its own time. Other works by Byron, such as his work Cain, which is written kind of around the same time as Don Juan, was similarly criticized for its blasphemy. Cain is a story about Cain and Abel. And Lucifer is a character in that, and he says loads of blasphemous things. Byron defended himself against charges of blasphemy by saying, well, the devil would say that, wouldn't he? But the thing is, you find yourself agreeing with Lucifer. That's the thing. And initially, Don Juan was initially published anonymously for fear of prosecution, but everyone knew who it was, who had produced it. Yeah. Here I've got a few pictures here of Byron's European legacy. He was very much a European man. So we've... Oh, that hasn't worked. Oh. Hang on. Oh, there seems to be an error. Doesn't seem to be working very well. Doesn't seem to be... No, it doesn't seem to be working. But anyway, I can talk to this slide a little bit anyway. So this image here is of 3 European sort of monuments to Byron. So the one on the left is the Hotel Centrale from Ravenna in Italy. Hotel Centrale Byron from Ravenna in Italy. The one in the middle is the Lord Byron Memorial in the Garden of Heroes in Missolonghi in Greece. And on the right is the Lord Byron statue in Athens. So that's the kind of legacy he has in Europe. So you go to lots of places in Italy, you've probably seen this yourself, guys, you probably know better than me, and there'll be a hotel, Hotel di Byron, or something like that. It's quite a common thing. It's certainly in Greece as well. Why is this the case? Now, I think there seems to be a problem with the slide, but it doesn't really matter too much. So, as I mentioned, he was regarded as a hero in Greece after his support for the Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire, which was a war fought between 1821 and 1829. And, oh, it seems to be stuck. Oh, here we go. Yes, anyway, so, and Byron was a kind of important figure in what is called Philhellenism, which is this kind of love of Greek culture. And that movement, this influenced increased political engagement from the great powers in the independence movement of Greece against the Turks. Philhellenism is, it would show on the slide, unfortunately, but it's not, it doesn't seem to be working. People really like the classics, ancient Greece, okay? and this love for the classics, it felt like, well, let's liberate Greece from the Turks, because they are the cradle of Western civilization. So, and Byron was a kind of important figure in this way. Hence why he got involved in the War of Independence. He didn't actually fight himself, and he died during this war, but he died essentially of a cold. He died of a fever, probably the treatment of his physicians drawing too much blood. But now, this is an important thing for you guys, I suppose, is Byron in Italy. What's the influence of that? So Byron, like contemporaries such as Percy Shelley, near the Spanish Steps in Rome, you have the Keats-Shelley house, for instance, really famous. Percy Shelley and Keats. Keats only spent a little bit of time in Italy because he came over and died, basically. Byron spent a significant time in Italy, and between 1817, actually I think it's 1816, actually, there might be a bit of a mistake, he was primarily based in Venice, Ravenna, Pisa, and finally Genoa. And he was already successful by this time, okay? He was already well known. But it's worth noting that Italy and Italian culture was a significant influence on Byron's poetry. Really significant influence on Byron's poetry. And here's just a quotation from a fairly recent work from 2017. That's recent in my idea anyway, 7 years ago. Anyway, the connection between Byron and Italy is one of the most familiar facts about British Romanticism. But this is the important bit. He wrote much of his greatest work in Italy. It's not just, we know that Byron went to Italy, we know there's a kind of Italian influence. It's that stress on his best stuff was produced while living here. And I think that's a really important note to make. So, a lot of biographical focus. Byron was quite a notorious figure. There's a lot of biographical focus on this time. These 6 or 7 years that he spent in this. But the poetic influence is clear, and that's what I'm going to kind of talk about. All of his masterpiece, Don Juan, for instance, was written in Italy. The earlier cantos, so canto is just it's kind of a way of saying part, in a way. Canto comes from song, like music, but it just means sort of part or book. Sometimes it's called books. Book 1 of Paradise Lost, for instance. So the earlier ones were written in Venice and Ravenna, and the later cantos were mainly in Pisa and Genoa. So what was the Italian influence then? Well, obviously, landscapes of Italy, the settings and culture, really crucial influences. I mean, it's a beautiful country, obviously, as you guys know very well. Beppo, very important poem in lots of ways, and particularly in relation to the poem Don Juan that we're going to talk about, was written and set in Venice during Carnival season. And this is what he says about it in a typically Byronic way. With all its sinful doings, I must say that Italy's a pleasant place to me, who love to see the sun shine every day, and vines not nailed to walls, from tree to tree, festooned much like the back scene of a play, or melodrama which people flock to see, when the first act is ended by a dance, in vineyards copied from the south of France. He's writing about the period of Carnival, where lots of sinful things are happening, lots of people behaving how they wouldn't do in normal times. But also, it's got nice weather, which if you're someone born in England, you certainly appreciate about Italy. But it's that kind of, hopefully, you can start to see, particularly when we look at some other stanzas from this poem Beppo, what Byron, the sort of Byron style in a way, and what he kind of liked about Italy, and what he how he wrote about it. I also like to dine on beccaficas, which is a type of songbird, right? To see the sunset, sure he'll rise tomorrow, not through a misty morning twinkling weak as a drunken man's dead eye in maudlin sorrow, but with all heaven to himself, that day will break as beauteous as cloudless, nor be forced to borrow that sort of farthing candlelight which glimmers where reeking London's smoky cauldron simmers. I love the language, that soft bastard Latin, which melts like kisses from a female mouth, and sounds as if it should be writ on satin, with syllables which breathe of the sweet south, and gentle liquids gliding all so pat in, that not a single accent seems uncouth, like a harsh northern whistling, grunting guttural, which we're obliged to hiss and spit and sputter all. Now, what I love about these two, and hopefully these two stanzas here, is he's talking quite beautifully, on the one hand, about his love for the Italian language. Like kisses from a female mouth, sounds as if it should be writ on satin, and syllables which breathe of the sweet south. But he also talks about bastard Latin and rhymes guttural with sputteral. And he makes a joke about it being grey all the time in England. What I like about Italy is I can wake up in the morning and expect it to be sunny. I mean, maybe not today. I just got caught in a thunderstorm earlier. Whereas in England, I'd have to have a little penny candle to make some light. It's that kind of move between that sort of reverence of the beauty of Italian language, but he still uses the word bastard, right, to describe it. It's that sort of movement between high and low, that kind of comedic with the kind of sensitive, poetic beauty that I think is characteristic of Byron's best work. And we'll come back to that a little bit more later. And he does that talking about Italy, which I think is important. Now, I want to talk about this verse form called ottava rima. I'm not an Italian speaker, so I'm probably not pronouncing it correctly. But the poem I've just been speaking about, or quoting from, is a poem called Beppo, and it uses this verse form called ottava rima, stanza form, okay? As you can guess, it's kind of Italian, isn't it? Italian verse form. And he later employs it to great effect in his masterpiece, Don Juan. Yeah, as I've mentioned, it's Italian verse form. The exclamation mark emphasizes the point. It's Italian. I've got a bit of color coding going on here, although I realize it's not quite as clear when we get to it. So, what ottava rima is you have a stanza, okay, of 8 lines. A stanza is just like a sort of grouping, sometimes called a verse, although verse is not quite accurate. You have 8 lines, and they have a rhyme scheme of A, B, A, B, A, B, C, C. Okay? So you have these rhymes like that. 6, A, B, A, B, A, B. Everyone understands what I mean by that thing. Yeah, lots of nods. That's good. That's good. My students don't nod. Anyway, so, well, here's an example of it in the poem Don Juan. This is I think this is the very first stanza of Canto 1. Maybe it's the second stanza, the very first. When he's saying, well, I'm going to write a poem about this guy called Don Juan, right? But, I want a hero for my poem. So he goes, I want a hero, an uncommon want, when every year and month sends forth a new one, till, after cloying the gazettes with cant, the age discovers he is not the true one. Of such as these I should not care to vaunt. I'll therefore take our ancient friend Don Juan. We all have seen him in the pantomime, sent to the devil somewhat ere his time. Now, I've underlined this here. Those of you sitting here going, why is he saying Juan instead of Juan? Well, he rhymes new one with Juan. He doesn't, so that's how you know it's pronounced Juan rather than Juan, okay? That's how it was tendency at the time for English-speaking people, when speaking of the Don Juan myth, to anglicize it to its Juan. And he uses this rhyme, new one, and true one, and Juan several times in Don Juan. It's kind of something he quite likes. But anyway, hopefully you can see, if I had thought, oh, hang on, wrong way. Hopefully you can see, I should really have color-coded the words rather than just put the letters at the end, how, want rhymes with cant or cant, vaunt and want, pantomime and time. So you have that final, the 2 C's at the end is what's called a couplet. And we'll come back to that, the significance of a couplet, why that matters, why it might be important. So that's the rhyme scheme. And he gets that from Italian. Now, how does he get there? Well, we can kind of speculate in lots of ways. So I mentioned earlier his poem, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Now, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage used Spencerian stanzas which are a little bit different, but maybe they're not that different. So this stanza here from Childe Harold's Pilgrimage is Childe Harold 3, Canto 3. And the reason I've got this image here, there's the Battle of Waterloo. So there's the traveller Childe Harold visits the battlefield of Waterloo, and he's disgusted that we celebrate this place of carnage as a great British victory. And so a lot of this is laced with kind of irony. Stop, for thy tread is on an empire's dust. An earthquake spoils sepulchred below. Is the spot marked with no colossal bust, nor column trophied for triumphal show? None but the moral's truth tell simpler so. As the ground was before, thus let it be. How that red rain hath made the harvest grow. And is this all the world has gained by thee, thou first and last of fields, king-making victory? So as you can see, the rhyme scheme is a little bit different. It's 9, so the stanza is 9 lines. And you don't have that couplet on its own at the end, do you? You have, you kind of have a rhyme that's a little bit earlier in the stanza. So it doesn't come out of the blue. The couplet doesn't go wham out of the blue. It's sort of, you're led up to it, as it were. We'll see why this kind of matters. Now, but you can also see how it's sort of similar to a Tava Rima. It's called a Spenserian stanza because it's named after the poet Edmund Spenser, who came up with it, and he wrote The Fairy Queen, which is a ridiculously long poem, which we used to get our students to read in full, but then that didn't work because it's very long, trust me. So Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, the one we just read out, is a politically engaged poem, but not quite as funny or as satiric as the later Beppo or Don Juan. Now, as we've already seen, perhaps a Tava Rima is not such a huge step from these Spenserian stanzas. He's lost a line and he slightly tweaks where he makes the couplet stand out. Perhaps we can think of it this way. Can we think of the Spenserian stanza as an English stanza? It's influenced by a very influential English poet, whereas a Tava Rima is kind of Italian. Now, I've put them in sort of inverted commas because, yes, a Tava Rima is an Italian form, but probably the most famous practitioner of a Tava Rima is BYRON, certainly in English literary history. The choice of verse, a Tava Rima in Don Juan and Beppo, might be twofold then. Perhaps it's better for satiric purposes, satire, producing satire, and we'll kind of talk about that. But also, it's better at reflecting the sort of exoticism of the setting of the two poems. Remember, his readership would have been English-speaking people back in grey old London or Aberdeen, okay? So, Beppo is Venice, Carnival in Venice. That's very attractive. But he actually says this as much in the poem itself, Don Juan itself. This chap here on the slide is, I'm going to mangle his name, is the poet Pulci, okay, who was a 15th century Italian poet who is one of the innovators of a Tava Rima verse form. And BYRON talks about this in Don Juan. To the kind reader of our sober clime, that means England, sober clime, again he's talking about the weather, of our sober clime, this way of writing will appear exotic. Pulci, this guy here, was sire of the half-serious rhyme, who sang when chivalry was more quixotic, and revelled in the fancies of the time, true knights, chaste dames, huge giants, kings despotic. But all these, save the last, being obsolete, I chose a modern subject as more meet. If you're wondering what he's talking about in this stanza, quixotic, he's referring to Don Quixote, and that tradition of knights and quests and things like that. So he's saying he wrote in that time, and he wrote about those sorts of subjects. I'm going to write about more modern things in my poem, but I'm going to use his verse form. That's what he's kind of talking about. I want you to remember that line he says, half serious, as well, half serious. It's quite important. So why is a Tava Rima so good for satire, in my opinion? And lots of critics think the same as me, or I think the same as them. You know, who comes, chicken and egg, whatever. Well, that couplet comes out the blue, doesn't it? That rhyming couplet at the end comes out the blue, whacks you in the face. And in a way, the rhyming couplet often in Byron's poems, in the what you call the ottava rima poems, it kind of undermines the previous 6 lines of the stanza. So it kind of undercuts it. So you've been saying something quite moving and profound, and then you go, bang, couplet, kind of make a silly pun, silly joke, undermines it. And this is frequently through, or is an example of perhaps, what you call bathos. Now the image I have on the slide is an 18th century image of sort of bathos. Now what is bathos? It's sort of, you might have heard of pathos with a P, which is related to sort of, you know, you're moved by something that's pathetic in the old sense of the term. But bathos is a bit different. Bathos, using the Oxford English Dictionary definition, is like the ludicrous descent from the elevated to the commonplace in writing or speech. Anticlimax, basically. And bathos, or anticlimax, is a great weapon of satire. And ottava rima is a great medium. So anticlimax is like, you know, I've got this exciting invention, but then press the button, it's kind of funny, isn't it, right? It doesn't work, right? That's kind of example of bathos. You can kind of see why it works. And also, note that phrase that from the previous slide, half serious. Don Juan is what you call a mock epic. So it's an epic poem about epic themes, like, you know, taking in the vein of Paradise Lost by Milton or Spenser's Fairy Queen, but it's also making fun of it. So in a way, that very idea of a mock epic is pathetic, like example of bathos, something grand, but it's something silly as well. It's like people hiding under beds from lovers and that sort of thing, instead of like fighting giants, right? Well, let's look at an example of bathos in action, as I say. So in this stanza, Don Juan he's still a teenager at this point, and he's in love. He's in love, and he's thinking about this. He's having these great thoughts. He pored upon the leaves and on the flowers, and heard a voice in all the winds. And then he thought of wood nymphs and immortal bowers, and how the goddesses came down to men. He missed the pathway, he forgot the hours, and when he looked upon his watch again, he found how much old time had been a winner. He also found he had lost his dinner. So, this is what he might look like when eating his dinner with his messy spaghetti. There we go. So, from high thoughts of romantic love to, oh, where's my dinner? You know, can you see that movement from high thoughts to low? That's an example of bathos. And so much comedy and satire uses this kind of pathetic form. And that idea of a couplet, winner and dinner, rhyming together, creates that effect, right? And also, I think Byron is, I've titled it Henpecked Rhymes, because I couldn't really think of what else to call it. Byron is really great in the poem Don Juan when he uses loads of intentionally bad rhymes. They're kind of funny. And in a way, they sort of draw attention. I mentioned this kind of postmodernism of Byron. They draw attention self-consciously to the poem itself. A really great example of this is this stanza here. When Don Juan's mother is supposedly an intellectual woman, and the poet Byron is kind of musing on why anybody would marry an intellectual woman, which is also a bit kind of charged against his wife as well, or his ex-wife, should I say, who was a apparent blue stocking or intellectual woman. 'Tis pity learned virgins ever wed with persons of no sort of education, or gentlemen who, though well born and bred, grow tired of scientific conversation. I don't choose to say much upon this head. I'm a plain man and in a single station. But, O ye lords of ladies intellectual, inform us truly, have they not henpectual? I mean, it's very forced, isn't it? But it's almost funny because it's kind of forced. He's like, if you imagine you're doing a creative writing assignment and you're told, right, find something that rhymes with intellectual, and he's done it. Henpectual. It's very awkward, but it's kind of amusing because of that. Oh, hang on. For some reason, it's done that. There you go. There's the stanza I just read out. Sorry, I thought it would produce the whole thing behind me. Oh, it seems to be stuck again. Oh, here we go. So, in conclusion then, Byron remains one of the greatest poets and satirists in English literary history. His greatest work is that which is in ottava rima form, particularly the work we spent most of the time talking about, which is Don Juan. A form particularly suited for satire, I argue, because it has that potential for bathos that I've been talking about, that kind of high and low. And this is a form learned from reading Italian poets, but also English translations and imitators of Italian that I haven't really spoken about today. And he produced most of this work in Italy. And this speaks not only to the thematic influence of Italy and Italian culture, but its formal influence too. In other words, it's not just the setting, it's not just he's influenced by Italy because it's a nice place, so I'm going to set it in this period, in this place, but also the writing that was produced by Italian writers as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. So we've got some time for questions. And while you're thinking of your questions, I'm just going to fire off one of my own very quickly. So, Dr. Whickman, I wondered, you mentioned that he was a satirical poet. Mm-hmm. What were the targets of his satire?
Oh, what wasn't the target of his satire? But I would say, like a lot of his great heroes before him, it was often I would say probably the word that's often associated with Byron and what he was making fun of is that word cant, which I quoted. And cant is like hypocrisy and sort of nonsense and that people say when they don't really mean anything by it. I would have sworn, but I didn't because it's a school. And that's probably a major target. You know, he interrogates the language we use every day, the language of authority and power, for instance. And he would often call that cant, that kind of the nonsense that people come out with which controls us in a way. But also the manners of the hypocrisy and manners of aristocracy, other poets, most famously Robert Southey, who, a poet that we don't really know much about today. My PhD supervisor was an expert in Robert Southey, and she's like one of the few. But Robert Southey, his probably most famous contribution to English literature today is the story of the Three Bears. So you might have read some Robert Southey without realizing it. He didn't invent Goldilocks. Goldilocks was an addition by someone else. But yeah, that's one of his famous contributions. But Robert Southey was poet laureate of the day, and he's often remembered now as sort of Byron's major antagonist. The poem Don Juan is dedicated to Bob Southey, as he calls it, which is quite he was the poet laureate, the chief poet, and Byron just absolutely eviscerates him. So sorry, I waffled a little bit, but yes, lots of things, but Robert Southey is a good example.
Thank you. So guys, questions from you. Did you have a question?
I really like the concept of an anti-hero.
Great.
And I was wondering if there was any way that you think that it could relate to the concept of maybe a villain or an enemy or something malicious present.
Great. So you're saying are anti-heroes a bit like villains?
Yes.
Well, yes, is the short answer. I would say a major influence on the Byronic hero, the anti-hero, would be Satan. Could you think of a more villainous guy than that? Well, I could do, yeah. John Milton, in his poem Paradise Lost, people often read that and think that Satan's kind of the hero in that. It's kind of controversial in the 17th century to write that. And there's a lot of debate about that. But that's because Satan represents this kind of foiled, tortured person. I had justly rebelled against the authoritarian God, and I was punished, and here I am in hell. Oh, it's kind of heroic. But ultimately, he's a villain in that. So there is a kind of fine line. There is a fine line between the villain.
And you would say that the difference between them is like their morale, their behavior, or intentions.
That's a very good follow-up question. I suppose the difference is when it gets to it, there's a certain point where they have to make a decision. Satan in Paradise Lost is like, I want to revenge myself by causing the fall of man. Whereas, say, the Romantics often associated, and Byron did this as well, associated Prometheus. Is everyone aware of Prometheus? Often associated Prometheus as a kind of sort of heroic figure. And he's kind of like Satan, except he does it selflessly. He gives, whereas Satan just wants it for himself. He wants revenge for the sake of revenge. Prometheus is selfless. So it's like these kind of fine lines. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good question.
Okay, other questions, guys? So Senya and then Gaia.
So I think it's safe to assume that he had a lot of kind of allusions to religious figures in his poems, with the poem Cain and just kind of mentions of it throughout. I was wondering what were his religious views, as he was quite controversial for them, but he was also, I guess, fixated on it. So what was his upbringing in comparison to later on kind of views on God and Christianity? I'm assuming because of Europe. Okay.
Yeah. That's an excellent question. How long have you got, really? There's been a lot of discussion about Byron's religious position. He was friends with Percy Shelley, friends and contemporary Percy Shelley. Percy Shelley is often considered an atheist, an out-and-out atheist. By today's standards, he probably isn't. But anyway, Byron was nowhere near that. He often considered himself a Christian. But he also blasphemed a lot in his works. So he often defended himself, as I said earlier, by saying, well, if I'm going to have Lucifer in my poem, he's going to say bad things. He's Lucifer, right? He's Satan. He's going to say bad things. His views are, he was often considered kind of engaged, one of his illegitimate daughters was raised in a convent, Catholic. So here there's kind of a Catholic inheritance. There's a Presbyterian inheritance. That's his background, because he was, he's born in Aberdeen. His family, George Gordon, as you can tell, are kind of Scottish. One way I think I would describe him is skeptic, which is not the same as saying kind of not religious. It often means you question kind of orthodox positions without necessarily rejecting them. So his religious views are complicated, but he wasn't at all an atheist like his pal Percy Shelley, which I've written a book on about that. It's available in all good bookshops now. Don't buy it, it's very expensive. A good question, though. There's whole books written on Byron and religion. So, good.
Thank you. I have more of a personal question. How did you know that this is what you wanted to study that this is like what you wanted to pursue for your career?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. Do you know, it's a really simple one, which is, on the one hand, I kind of liked this stuff. And I wanted people to keep paying me to do it. Is basically what it is. I also kind of enjoy, with Byron, I enjoy that sort of balance of the serious. We've been had questions about theology and anti-heroes, right? With that kind of silliness where he rhymes intellectual with henpectual. I kind of like that balance. And I think he's a good example of a poet who did that and managed that really well. In terms of my other interest in Romantic period scholarship, it's just, I think it's the period of literature that appealed to me the most. And I realised I quite like books. Yeah. And I wanted to keep reading them. And somehow they let me do it, and they kept letting me do it for now. They haven't discovered yet that it's a waste of everyone's time. Anyway, no, it's not a waste of time. Don't do that. I shouldn't be saying that. That's going to be edited out of the recording now.
Thank you.
Someone else? Okay. Some of these guys that are here have recently finished reading Daisy Miller by Henry James, who makes some allusions to Byron. So I'm curious, you know, if you can talk about that, later writers who have, you know, incorporated Byron in some way, alluded to him.
A very good question. We mentioned the Byronic hero, a figure who is a character in Byron's poems and influenced a kind of trope of characters, that sort of, you know, the kind of brooding anti-hero. But also Byron himself gets conflated with that. So often when you get a kind of sighing poet who's got a bit of a dark past, or there's hints they have a dark past, but they're kind of sexy at the same time, that's Byron. And the Victorians in particular really like that idea. So you get a lot of kind of Byronic heroes in sort of, or figures who are often compared to Byron in sort of Victorian writers and very later, you know, Victorian writers like Henry James. The example I always think of is George Eliot's Middlemarch, where Will Ladislaw is called a kind of a Byron or kind of a Shelley, depending on which page of the book it is, because he at one point thinks of himself as this kind of romantic figure. In many ways, Byron became, it's funny because Byron, as I mentioned earlier, he sort of doesn't fit as neatly as the other five of the big six as a kind of romantic writer, because the way he wrote is quite different in many ways to the others. But he has become a kind of archetype of like the romantic figure. So when you get a kind of someone who's meant, you know, readers want to look at this guy in a book they're reading about, and they want to know that he's a bit romantic and that he might have a bit of a dark past and he might be a bit, you know, might have certain passions, right? They just call him, oh, he's a bit Byronic, and everyone, the Victorian readers would get it, would know what you meant. Hopefully that answers your question.
It does, yeah, that's great. I think I'll hand it over.
So I just didn't quite understand the connection between the late period of his life in Italy and his death fighting or supporting the Turks.
Sorry, what was the question, sorry?
So the connection between his death, which wasn't in Italy, I assume, or was
No,
it?
that was in Greece. He died in Greece. Yeah.
So what happened in between?
So he moved. So the war for independence in Greece started in 1821. He died in 1824. So that's when he went off to sort of assist in 1821, which I should have, that's a good point, I should have demonstrated that. So he was in Italy for a large chunk of his life, and he spent the last bit in Greece. I say fighting in the Greek War of Independence, but really sort of, he was kind of like an administrator, as it were. He gave a lot of money and support, and he didn't, you know, to say he died during the war suggests he's like died in battle. No, he just died of a cold, as I put it. But yeah, that's kind of, it comes, so where that came from, I think I did mention it a little bit, but only in short. Greece is, you know, the center of Western culture in the 19th century. It's seen as the birthplace of like Western values. And obviously the Ottoman Empire, of course, is kind of is Muslim, right? So became a kind of melting pot of clash of civilizations at the time, in a way. Greek culture gave us, you know, the Iliad, the Odyssey, you know, great classics. And so their freedom from the Turks was seen as a kind of defense of Western culture and civilization. And that's why he went and supported. And that's where Philhellenism, which unfortunately didn't display on the slide, is how that is involved with that.
Thank you.
Do you think that Byron's way of poetry and bathos affected any other poets that might have adapted it?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. We do associate, good question. Atavarima, he's, as I mentioned, he's kind of the guy who did Atavarima. Probably although Don Juan is probably his greatest poem, probably his greatest satire is one that's also in Atavarima called Vision of Judgment. But his mate Percy Shelley wrote an Atavarima poem called The Witch of Atlas, which is sort of ironic, but still kind of, he can't quite do satire like Byron does. Although a lot of my Shelley scholar friends would be like, no, he does. Percy Shelley was heavily influenced by Byron. There's even some suggestion that influence between the two, Byron and Shelley, is quite interesting. They influence each other in quite interesting ways. I mentioned Cain. A lot of the kind of more atheistic elements of Cain, he probably got some of that from Shelley, I argue, in a forthcoming paper. But anyway, so it's not really answering your question but that much. But he's clearly influenced the kind of satiric tradition that went on later. But that idea of something high and getting low is kind of important. I hinted, actually, I don't want to digress too much, but I hinted earlier about his postmodernism. And I'm not going to talk about postmodernism that much. Note that one of the poems I quoted from, let's go back here. This one, Beppo, was set in Venice during Carnival. And the carnival, the idea of carnival, where ranks are forgotten for the day. Okay? Everyone's wearing masks, you don't know who everyone is. That was been read by a chap called Mikhail Bakhtin as an example of, as leading to inspiring a type of writing called carnivalesque writing. Okay? And Byron is an example of a carnivalesque writer, where value systems are all turned on their head. There's lots of silly ideas mixed with very serious ideas. I won't get into it. There's a kind of an obsession with bodies as well, in a strange way. And the carnivalesque tradition is often seen as influence, as being basically an example of what became postmodernism. Okay, so his influence on later writers, he doesn't invent the carnivalesque, Byron. He gets it from earlier writers, but you can see that influence on later figures too. It's a bit of a digressive answer, I do apologise, but very Byronic, I suppose, digressive.
Thank you.
Sophia.
Was there any recurrent theme in his poems, or did he just write about anything?
Well, obviously there are some themes. We've spoke a lot about the Byronic hero, but I would say skepticism, flippancy, combined with a kind of reverence for beauty and nature, but also, but let's look at this turd over there as well. That kind of mixing of kind of high and low things. So common themes are the idea of so in his more serious works, you get this sense of forbidden knowledge. He wrote a great dramatic poem called Manfred, which is kind of Faustian. So this, after Goethe's Faust, but also Dr. Faustus, Christopher Marlowe. So theme of kind of people pursuing knowledge for the sake of it, pursuing things for the sake of it is a kind of a major theme, but also turning things on the head. A consistent theme is kind of inconsistency in many ways, but there are lots of Byronic things, which is people biting off more they can chew, that sort of thing. Yeah.
You said that before, that he was like one of the few of the poets of the Romantic era that were actually able to like sell their poems quite well. What do you think made him able to do that, like compared to the others? Like, what made him unique?
Really, that's a very good question, and I'm going to slightly speculate here. He had a great publisher a guy called John Murray, that helped a lot, who was quite politically different from Byron. Byron was what you would call a liberal, in the kind of old sense. He was a Whig, whereas, Whig is like the old, they became the Liberal Party and then eventually, whereas John Murray is more of a Tory. But I think the way that Byron wrote is he wrote in a kind of, he knew what would sell. He wrote in a sort of, if you look at the poem, if you look at those lines behind me, he talks about lots of different things, language that hits different sensibilities. So he talks about bastards, and but he also uses the word becaficas, which is like a songbird. Apparently it was a dish at the time to eat songbirds, right? Which is sort of weird. So it's that kind of, the different registers is what I would say. So he's able to tap into a kind of popular market in the way someone like Wordsworth, for instance, just couldn't. But in fact, it's interesting, so Byron was pirated a lot, so a lot of his works were heavily pirated. And if a work was pirated, it meant it was cheaper. It was available much more cheaply. And when Byron died and he's buried in Nottinghamshire, in a place called Hucknall, just outside central Nottingham, there was this belief amongst sort of more working class people that Byron was one of us. Despite being an aristocrat, he was one of us, one of the sort of working class people, rather than, sort of the aristocrat that people made out to be. There was a sense that he became, the way he spoke to a sort of a different class of people than to a lot of his contemporaries. You read a Percy Shelley poem, and you think, how on earth would he have sold anything? As brilliant as he is, he's not exactly mass market appeal. Where Byron, he's got sex, he's got like kind of visiting exotic places, silly jokes and silly rhymes. He's got lots going on that appeals to a sort of mass market. But I think that's kind of a bit speculative in what I think. But hopefully that answers your question.
Got time for one more question. Who's going to take the last question? Well, in which case, I'm dying to ask. You obviously we touched on the politics of Greece and nationalism, and I wondered how involved he got with politics here in Italy while he was here.
Well, I don't know loads about that, apart from I know that there were reports on him as a radical, there were spies. He witnessed someone getting murdered by a political rival, I think. There's accounts of that. I think that was in Ravenna, if I remember correctly. And he wrote in his letters that he felt Italy was on the verge of revolution at the time. Obviously, Italy wasn't a kind of united country then. It was different sort of provinces then. But there was a kind of... So yes, I think he was kind of associated with kind of radicalism in Italy at the time. And there was kind of dealings with the law as well. I mean, dealings with lots of different families, because he had a mistress, quite a few mistresses in different big families as well.
That's a different kind of politics.
Different type of politics, yes.
So, guys, thank you so much for all your questions. That was wonderful. And please join me in thanking Dr. Whickman for his talk.